The wind in this part of the West had a name, and it was Malice. It was born somewhere over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, a cold, indifferent thing that scoured the plains until nothing was left but dust, stubborn grass, and the bones of creatures not strong enough to stand against it. It howled through the canyons and rattled the window panes of the few scattered homesteads that dared to call this land home. It was a constant, keening reminder that the earth here was not meant to be tamed, only endured. The town, Redemption Gulch, was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the vast emptiness. It consisted of a general store, a saloon whose piano was always out of tune, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the sound of reluctant progress, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pointing an accusing finger at the merciless sky. Here, society was a brittle thing, held together by shared hardship and rigid prejudice. A man was judged by the sweat on his brow and the straightness of his aim. A woman was judged by her piety, her silence, and the husband she kept. For women, there were few choices: wife, mother, or widow. Anything else was a whisper, a scandal, a cautionary tale told to wide-eyed daughters. It was a land that offered a man a new start, but often gave a woman a final, lonely end. 10 miles from the judgment of Redemption Gulch, nestled in a shallow valley that offered meager protection from the wind, was John's ranch. It was a good spread, built with his own 2 hands, but now it felt less like a home and more like a tombstone he was forced to inhabit. For a year, John had been a ghost on his own land. The laughter had died in his throat the day the blizzard took Martha. Now, his words were as sparse and essential as the water in his well. He moved with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man carrying an invisible weight. His shoulders stooped not from labor, but from loss. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, saw the world through a haze of memory. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it set, seeking an exhaustion so profound it might grant him a few hours of dreamless sleep. It rarely did. He was not alone in his grief, though it felt that way. Martha's cousin, Sarah, was a fixture in the house, as permanent and unyielding as the stone hearth. Sarah was a widow herself, her husband taken by a fever 3 years prior. When she had come to help Martha with the birth that never happened, she had simply stayed after the blizzard, after the burying. There was no question of her leaving. She refused. She was a woman carved from the same hard land she inhabited. Her hands were calloused, her gaze direct, and her silence was different from John's. His was a hollow, aching void. Hers was a fortress, solid and impenetrable. She ran the house with a fierce efficiency that left no room for sentiment. The floors were scrubbed. The bread was baked. The mending was done. She moved through the rooms that had been her cousin's with a proprietary air, a quiet claim staked in the heart of John's sorrow. She was the sentinel of his grief, and he did not have the strength or the will to ask her to leave. They orbited each other in a universe of unspoken things, 2 solitary planets held in place by the gravity of the woman they had both lost. The idea came to John one evening in the spring. As he stared into the fire, the flames licked at the logs, consuming them, and he felt a kinship with the wood. He was being consumed, whittled down to ash. The silence of the house pressed in, a physical force. Sarah was on the other side of the room, her needle flashing in the lamplight. A rhythmic, maddeningly steady sound. He needed a change. He needed a noise that wasn't the wind or the whisper of his own regrets. He needed life. Not the life he had, which was a pale imitation, but something new. A fresh start was a fool's dream, but perhaps a different kind of existence was possible. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the wood floor. Sarah didn't look up, but her needle paused for a fraction of a second. "I'm writing for a wife," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Now she looked up, her dark eyes unreadable. She placed her sewing in her lap. "A wife," she repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, weighted with something he couldn't decipher. Contempt? Pity? A woman to help, To fill the house, he couldn't bring himself to say. To replace Martha. The words were a betrayal he could not speak aloud. Sarah's gaze was unwavering. This house is full enough. Her voice was low, but it cut through the room. It was full of him, of her, of the ghost of Martha. They were a crowd of three. "It's my decision," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned and walked to the small desk in the corner, retrieved a pen and paper, and began to write. He did not write of love, or companionship, or shared dreams. He wrote of acreage, of livestock, of the need for a hardy woman who was not afraid of work. He offered a home, passage, and his name. It was a business transaction, a desperate purchase of a future he could no longer imagine on his own. He sealed the letter and knew, with a grim certainty, that he had just set something in motion that he could not control. Across the room, Sarah picked up her sewing again, the needle resuming its silent, relentless work. Hundreds of miles away, in the grimy, crowded streets of Boston, that letter found its way into the hands of Emily, an orphan since the age of 10. Emily had spent the last decade as a ward of a stern aunt who saw her as little more than an unpaid servant and another mouth to feed. Her world was one of gray skies, cobblestone streets, and the suffocating propriety of a society that had no place for a woman with no dowry and no connections. Her dreams were small, fragile things, a patch of sky she could call her own, a kind word, the warmth of a hand held in affection rather than duty. John's letter was stark and unadorned. Yet, to Emily, it read like a psalm of hope, a home, a husband, a new life. The West was a terrifying, unknown entity, a land of savages and hardship according to the penny dreadfuls she had read. But what could be more savage than a life of invisible servitude? What could be harder than a heart that ached with the constant, dull pain of being unwanted? She looked at her reflection in the warped glass of her small attic window, a pale, slender girl with wide, hopeful eyes and hands too soft for the life she was about to choose. She penned her acceptance with a trembling hand, her simple, elegant script a stark contrast to John's rough scrawl. She packed her few belongings, a spare dress, her mother's locket, and a book of poetry, and turned her face toward the setting sun, toward a man whose face she had never seen and a life she could only imagine. The journey was a brutal education. The train ride was a clattering, smoke-filled ordeal that slowly stripped away the familiar green of the East, replacing it with an endless expanse of brown and gold. The final leg of the trip, by stagecoach from the nearest railhead, was a bone-jarring torment. The coach was crowded with sour-faced men who smelled of whiskey and dust. Emily huddled by the window, clutching her small bag, feeling her city-bred manners peeling away with every lurch and sway. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to bruise with gray clouds by the afternoon of the final day. A low rumble echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, the same malevolent wind John knew so well, and began to whip Emily's bonnet from her head and tear at the canvas roof of the stagecoach. Rain began to fall, not in gentle drops, but in thick, angry sheets that turned the dusty track into a slick river of mud. Inside the coach, the men grumbled. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the wild, untamed nature she had only read about. It was terrifying. The driver urged the horses on, his shouts lost in the rising roar of the storm. A sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit the landscape, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to split the very air. The horses, spooked and wild-eyed, reared in their harnesses. The coach lurched violently to one side, a wheel finding a deep, muddy rut. There was a terrible splintering sound, a moment of weightlessness, and then a chaotic crash as the world tumbled sideways into darkness. Emily came to with the taste of mud in her mouth and a sharp pain in her side. Rain plastered her hair to her face. She was lying on the ground, tangled in her own skirts, a few feet from the overturned coach. One of the men was groaning, another was cursing. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her back down. Through the curtain of rain, she saw a figure on horseback approaching. A lone rider, broad-shouldered and solid, a silhouette against the storm-darkened sky. He dismounted with an economy of motion, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. He paid no mind to the other men, his eyes scanning the wreckage until they found her. He knelt beside her, and she got her first look at her husband-to-be. He was older than she had imagined, his face carved with lines of hardship and something that looked like profound sadness. His eyes were gray and piercing. He was not handsome in the way of the men in Boston, but there was a raw, undeniable strength to him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, as rough as the land around them. I don't think so," she stammered, shivering from cold and shock. He assessed her with a quick, practiced glance. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms. She was startlingly light. Emily gasped, her hands instinctively going to his shoulders. He felt as solid as an old oak tree. He carried her to his horse, placed her in the saddle, and then swung up behind her, his body a warm, firm shield against the wind and rain. "Hold on," he commanded, and nudged the horse into a steady walk, leading them away from the wreck and into the deepening gloom. She did as she was told, her cheek pressed against the damp wool of his coat, the steady beat of his heart a strange comfort against her ear. He was her rescuer. He was her husband. Perhaps, she thought, her desperate gamble had paid off. The ride was a blur. The rain eventually subsided to a miserable drizzle as they arrived at the ranch. It was a sturdy, simple home, a log cabin with a stone chimney from which a thin plume of smoke rose into the damp air. A barn and several outbuildings stood nearby. As John helped her down, the front door of the cabin opened. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and severe, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She held a lantern, and in its golden light, her face was a mask of cold appraisal. She looked Emily up and down, from her mud-caked boots to a ruined dress and disheveled hair. Her gaze was not welcoming. It was a judgment, a dismissal. "This is Emily," John said, his voice flat. He offered no other introduction, no explanation. The woman, Sarah, merely nodded, her lips a thin, uncompromising line. "Supper's on the table. It's getting cold." She turned and walked back inside, leaving Emily standing on the porch, feeling the chill of the evening air seep into her bones. The warmth she had felt in John's arms vanished, replaced by a new, more profound kind of cold. This was not the welcome she had dreamed of. This was an intrusion. The days that followed were a lesson in isolation. Emily tried to adapt, to find her place in this silent, rigid world. The wilderness she had to conquer was not outside, but within the four walls of the cabin. Cooking on a wood-burning stove was a battle of wits. The smoke stung her eyes and blackened her pots, and Sarah would watch her struggles with a cool, detached silence, never offering help, only correcting her mistakes after the fact, milking the cow. Bessie was a clumsy, frustrating exercise. The animal seemed to sense her fear and would flick its tail into her face or refuse to stand still, earning Emily a clipped sigh from Sarah, who could milk the same cow in half the time with an effortless grace. Every corner of the house seemed to belong to someone else. It was clean, meticulously so, but it held the imprint of the woman who had come before her. A piece of embroidery hung on the wall, a delicate floral pattern half finished, the needle still in the fabric as if its owner had just stepped away. A particular rocking chair by the fire seemed to be an unspoken shrine. No one sat in it. It belonged to Martha. Emily felt like a trespasser in her own home, a ghost haunting the life of another ghost. Her main adversaries were the two silences. Sarah's was a sharp, watchful thing. She was a constant presence, her eyes following Emily's every move, her lack of words a louder condemnation than any shouted insult. John's silence was worse. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief. He was there, yet he was not. At the supper table, he ate without tasting, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. He never spoke unless it was a direct necessity, a one-word answer to a question, a curt instruction about a chore. Emily's attempts at conversation died in the oppressive quiet, her cheerful questions about the weather or the livestock meeting a wall of indifference. She yearned to know the man she had married, to see a flicker of the rescuer who had carried her from the storm. But that man was gone, replaced by this hollow shell. Her suspicion about Sarah's role in the household began as a small, nagging question and grew into a certainty. Sarah was not a guest, nor was she a housekeeper. She was the mistress of this domain in all but name. One afternoon, while sweeping the main room, Emily saw Sarah go to John's bedroom, their bedroom, to fetch a spare blanket. She didn't knock. She simply took a key from a hook by the kitchen door, a small, black iron key, and unlocked the door with a familiar, practiced motion. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet house, a sound that confirmed Emily's status as an outsider. Sarah knew where everything was, from the spare linens to the sacks of flour in the pantry. She anticipated John's needs before he spoke them, placing a cup of coffee at his elbow in the morning, having his mended shirt ready for him. She and John moved around each other with the familiarity of a long-married couple, their life a choreography of shared habits and unspoken understanding. Emily was the one who was out of step, always in the way. The first night had set the tone for all the nights that followed, after the cold supper on her day of arrival. Sarah had retired to a small room off the kitchen. John had gestured for Emily to follow him to the master bedroom at the back of the house. The room was large and cold. A huge 4-poster bed, clearly built for a man of John's size, dominated the space. A single candle flickered on the nightstand, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Emily's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was it. This was the moment she would become a wife in truth. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded primly in her lap, and waited. John did not come to the bed. He walked to the window and stood there, his back to her, staring out at the dark prairie. The silence stretched, becoming thin and taut, ready to snap. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, the chirp of crickets outside. She watched his silhouette, a statue of sorrow outlined by the pale moonlight. Finally, he turned. His eyes met hers across the room. There was no warmth in them, no desire. There was only a vast, tired emptiness. He looked at her as if she were a stranger he had just met on the road, a complication he didn't know how to solve. He looked at the bed, then back at her, and a flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his features. He shook his head, a barely perceptible motion. "I can't," he whispered, the words so quiet they were almost swallowed by the night. Then he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. A moment later, she heard the back door of the cabin open and close. Emily sat there, alone in the big, cold bed. The hope that had carried her across a continent, that had survived the storm and the crash, finally crumbled. She was not a wife. She was a purchase, a reminder of what he had lost, a presence in a bed he could not bear to share. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and curled into a small ball under the heavy quilt that still smelled faintly of another woman's lavender scent. The tears came then, hot and silent, soaking into the pillow. She wept for the girl in Boston who had dared to dream, and for the woman who had woken up to a cold, heartbreaking reality. Outside, somewhere in the darkness of the barn, her husband had chosen to sleep with his horses, leaving her utterly and completely alone. The silence in the house was not empty. It was thick with the dust of unspoken words. Weeks bled into one another, each day a mirror of the last. Emily learned the rhythm of the ranch, the pre-dawn chill of the kitchen, the lowing of the cattle, the endless cycle of chores performed under Sarah's hawk-like gaze. She grew thinner, her skin tanned by the relentless sun, but the hope in her eyes had dimmed to a guarded flicker. The story of Martha came out on a stiflingly hot afternoon. The air was still and heavy, and even the wind had given up its fight. Emily was churning butter. The rhythmic plunge and splash of the dasher a monotonous counterpoint to the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. Sarah sat at the table, mending one of John's work shirts with small, angry stitches. "You work that dasher like you're afraid of it," Sarah said without looking up. Her voice, as always, was devoid of warmth. "I'm doing my best," Emily replied, her cheeks flushing. Sarah set the shirt down and finally looked at her. Her eyes were the color of slate, hard and cool. "Your best isn't what this place needs. This place needs a woman who isn't afraid to break a sweat or a nail. A woman like Martha." The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned by Sarah's sharp tongue. Emily's hands faltered on the churn. "She loved this ranch," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "More than John. Sometimes, I think, she was born out here, understood it. She knew the smell of the air before a storm, knew which calf would be the strongest. She wasn't a fragile thing from the city. The insult was plain, a perfectly aimed dart." Emily said nothing, merely resumed her churning, her movements now more forceful. "The blizzard that took her, it wasn't supposed to be that bad," Sarah said, her gaze drifting to the window, as if she could see the memory playing out across the sun-scorched yard. The sky was just a little gray. John had gone into town for supplies. He was meant to be back before nightfall. Martha was with child, near her time, and she went out to the barn to check on a sick ewe. She was stubborn that way, always had to see to things herself. Sarah picked up the shirt again, but her hands were still. The snow started. Not a gentle fall, but a blinding, furious whiteout came out of nowhere. 1 minute, you could see the mountains. The next, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The wind, it sounded like a dying animal. I was here, in this kitchen. I begged her not to go, but she wouldn't listen. She said the ewe needed her. She wrapped her shawl around her and walked out that door. Emily stopped churning. The only sound was the buzzing of the fly. John was late. Sarah's voice dropped to a near whisper, laced with an ancient bitterness. The storm delayed him. By the time he rode in, hours after dark, half frozen himself. It was too late. We searched all night. The whole world was just white. We found her in the morning, not 50 yards from the barn, buried in a snowdrift. She'd lost her way in the blindness of it all. The cold took her and the baby both. She looked directly at Emily, her eyes burning with a cold fire. He wasn't here to save her. He was in town, and she died alone in the snow. That is the ghost you live with in this house. Girl, that is the man who sleeps in the barn. The story settled over Emily like a shroud. It explained the hollowness in John's eyes, the crushing weight of his silence. But it did not explain Sarah. It did not explain the key to the bedroom, or the way she ran the house as if it were her own. A few days later, the other piece of the puzzle was laid at her feet. Sarah was sorting through a small wooden chest, a chest that had belonged to Martha. She pulled out a stack of old, ribbon-tied letters and a faded daguerreotype. For a moment, her severe expression softened into something Emily had never seen before, a deep, aching nostalgia. "She kept everything," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Emily. She looked up, as if suddenly remembering she was not alone, and her guard went back up. She saw Emily's curious gaze and hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "He was mine first, you know," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. Emily blinked. I don't understand." "John—" Sarah held up the daguerreotype. It showed a much younger John, his face unlined and smiling. standing beside a young woman. For a second, Emily thought it was Martha, but the woman's eyes were darker, fiercer. It was Sarah. We grew up on neighboring homesteads. We were promised to each other since we were children. Everyone knew it. We were in love. The word sounded foreign and uncomfortable on her lips. "What happened?" Emily whispered, drawn into the story despite herself. "My cousin Martha came to visit from back east. She was prettier than me, softer. She knew how to blush and lower her eyes. She was everything our mothers told us a proper wife should be. I was too wild, too opinionated, too much like a man. They said..." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "John's father was a hard man. He saw Martha and decided she was better stock for his son. A better match. Our families. They had their reasons. It was decided. John fought it, for a time. But in the end, he did what was expected of him. He married my cousin, and I married a good, kind man I did not love, who died of a fever 2 years later." She placed the photograph back in the box and closed the lid with a decisive snap. "So, you see, Emily from Boston, this house is built on a foundation of things that should have been. You are not the first replacement to walk these floors." The confession, meant perhaps to wound, did more than that. It solidified Emily's own sense of worthlessness. She wasn't just a substitute for a dead wife. She was a pale imitation of 2 women John had, in their own ways, loved. She was a mail-order convenience, a body to fill a space, a pair of hands for the chores. She began to study her reflection in the small, cracked mirror in her room. She saw her plain face, her slender frame, her hands, which despite the calluses were still not as capable as Sarah's. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing to catch a man's eye, let alone his heart. Her loneliness became a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that no amount of food or work could fill. She was an island in a sea of shared history, and the tide was pulling her under. The simmering tension between John and Sarah finally boiled over one evening in late summer. A cattle buyer had been to the ranch and made an offer on a portion of their herd. John wanted to sell. He needed the money for a new bull and winter supplies. Sarah was vehemently against it. Emily was darning socks by the weak light of an oil lamp, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. "It's not the right price, John, and you know it," Sarah argued, her hands on her hips. "We hold out until after the first frost. The price will go up." "We might lose some to the cold if we wait," John countered, his voice a low rumble. "This is a sure thing. We need the coin now." "We need to be smart," Sarah shot back, emphasizing the word. "I've managed this ranch's books for 5 years. I know the cycles. This is a mistake." "It's my name on the deed. Sarah, it's my decision." John's voice was hard, a tone Emily had never heard him use with Sarah. "Your name?" Sarah laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "And whose sweat has kept this place from falling into ruin since Martha died? Who balanced the ledgers and bargained with the traders and stitched you up when you were gored by that longhorn? You were a walking dead man. John, you would have drunk yourself into the grave or let the bank take everything if not for me." "That's enough," he growled, rising from his chair. He was a large man, and his anger seemed to fill the small room. But Sarah did not back down. She met his fury with her own, her eyes blazing. "No, it is not enough. You bring this girl." She spat the word, not even looking at Emily. "Into this house without a word to me. You think she can take my place? My cousin's place? She can't even milk a cow properly. You think putting a new wife in Martha's bed will fix you? It won't." "This is not about Martha," John roared, his hand slamming down on the table, making the lamp jump. "Everything is about Martha," Sarah screamed back, her voice cracking with a year of pent-up rage and grief. "And it's about me. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who held you together when you were falling apart. I'm the one who's kept you alive since she died." The words hung in the suffocating silence that followed. They were a raw, undeniable truth. Emily felt them like a physical blow. I'm the one who's kept you alive. She was nothing, a phantom, a piece of furniture in a house that was not hers, in a life that had no room for her. She was a testament to John's failure and a burden on Sarah's resilience. John stared at Sarah, his anger draining away, replaced by that familiar, haunted emptiness. He couldn't deny her words. He simply turned, grabbed his coat from a peg by the door, and walked out into the night. Sarah stood panting in the middle of the room, her shoulders heaving. She finally seemed to notice Emily, huddled in the corner. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of utter exhaustion. Without another word, she retreated to her own small room and closed the door. Emily sat alone, the sock and needle forgotten in her lap, the foundation of things that should have been. This was their house, their grief, their life. She had no part in it. The dream she had carried from Boston, the dream of being wanted, of being seen, turned to ash in her mouth. That night, the rain came. It started as a low drumming on the roof and grew into a torrential downpour, as if the sky itself were weeping. The wind howled, rattling the windows, mimicking the storm in Emily's soul. She lay in the cold, empty bed, listening to the tempest outside and the one raging within her. She couldn't stay. To stay would be to slowly fade away, to become a ghost even to herself. Sometime after midnight, she made her decision. It was an act of pure, unthinking desperation. She slipped out of bed, dressed quickly in the dark, and put on her sturdiest boots. She didn't pack a bag. She had nothing she wanted to take with her from this place. She crept through the dark cabin. A sliver of light from under Sarah's door told her the other woman was still awake. She didn't care. She slipped out the back door, into the cold, driving rain. Her destination was Redemption Gulch. It was 10 miles away, an impossible distance in this weather, but it was the only place she could think of. What she would do when she got there. She had no idea. She just knew she had to leave. She put her head down against the wind and started walking, the mud sucking at her boots with every step. The world was a maelstrom of blackness and noise. Rain blinded her, and the roar of the wind filled her ears. She stumbled on, following the faint outline of the wagon track by memory. After what felt like an eternity, she came to the ravine, a deep, rocky scar in the earth that the track skirted. A small wooden bridge, slick with rain, crossed it. As she took her first step onto the planks, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed into her. It knocked her off balance. Her foot slipped on the wet wood. For a terrifying moment, she flailed her arms, trying to regain her footing. And then she was falling, tumbling into the darkness. She landed with a sickening thud on a rocky ledge a dozen feet down, her head striking a stone. A burst of white-hot pain exploded in her ankle, and then the darkness swallowed her whole. It was the steady beat of a horse's hooves that brought her back to consciousness. She was lying in a small, rough-hewn shelter, a fire crackling in a crude stone hearth. A coarse blanket was tucked around her. Her head throbbed, and her ankle was a universe of pain, tightly bound with strips of cloth. A figure knelt by the fire, her back to Emily. It was Sarah. She was tending to a small pot, her movements efficient and sure, even here in this primitive line shack. "You're awake," Sarah said. Without turning around, she had found her. Of course, she had. Sarah knew this land, its every rock and crevice. She ladled some warm broth from the pot into a tin cup and brought it over. She propped Emily's head up with a surprising gentleness. "Drink this." Emily obeyed, the warm liquid a small comfort against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. "My ankle?" Emily whispered. "It's broken. I've set it as best I can. We'll have to get you back to the ranch when the storm passes and the light comes." They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. The anger and bitterness between them seemed to have been washed away by the storm, leaving only a raw, weary quiet. "Why did you come after me?" Emily finally asked. The question that had been circling in her mind. Sarah stared into the flames, her harsh features softened by the flickering light. "Because leaving a person to die in a storm is not something I can do," she said simply. Then she was quiet again. Emily thought that was the only answer she would get, but after a few moments, Sarah spoke again, her voice low and laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "I saw your tracks leading from the house. I knew where you were going. I also knew you wouldn't make it." She sighed, a long, shuddering breath. "When John brought you home, when I saw you standing on that porch, all mud-stained and hopeful, I hated you." The confession was so bald, so honest, it left Emily breathless. "I thought you would destroy what was left. I thought you were another mistake that I would have to clean up after. Another ghost to clutter up the rooms." She finally turned to look at Emily, and for the first time, Emily saw not a fortress of contempt, but a profound and shattering loneliness, a mirror of her own. "I was wrong," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you would break everything, but you're just like I was, all those years ago. A girl standing on the edge of the world, just dreaming of being seen." The return to the ranch was a silent, sodden affair. The storm had broken with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. John met them at the edge of the yard, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He had clearly been out searching, his horse lathered and his coat soaked through. His eyes flickered from Sarah's grim expression to Emily, cradled in front of Sarah on the saddle, her legs splinted and her face pale with pain. He said nothing. He simply lifted Emily from the horse, his arms strong and sure, and carried her inside as if she were a piece of fragile porcelain. He laid her gently on the large bed, their bed, and stepped back, his gaze lingering for a moment on her bandaged ankle before he turned and left the room. The dynamic in the house shifted after that night in the line shack. The sharp edges of Sarah's animosity had been worn smooth by the shared crisis. A grudging respect had taken its place. The Cold War of silence ended, replaced by a tentative truce, negotiated in the language of necessity and quiet understanding. Sarah, it turned out, was a fearsome and effective teacher when she chose to be, with Emily confined to a chair by the hearth for weeks while her ankle mended. Sarah's lessons became a part of the daily routine, but they were no longer about the proper way to churn butter. They were lessons in survival. "You flinch when he walks into the room," Sarah observed one afternoon, as she kneaded bread with powerful, rhythmic motions. "Stop it. This land preys on the weak. A man like John, he doesn't respect fear. He's got enough of his own." "I don't know how to be around him," Emily confessed, her voice small. "He doesn't see me." "Then you make him see you," Sarah said, slamming the dough onto the floured board. "Not by batting your eyelashes or whimpering in the corner. That's not the currency of this place. You make him see you by being useful, by being strong. He's a man who understands things that stand against the wind, not things that bend with it." Sarah began to teach Emily the intricate workings of the ranch, not just the house. She explained the ledgers, showing her the thin line between profit and ruin. She brought in different herbs from the garden, teaching her which ones could soothe a fever, which could stop bleeding, and which could ease pain. She taught Emily how to read the sky, to know the difference between a harmless cloud and the kind that carried hail. More than that, she began to teach Emily about John. "He likes his coffee black and scalding," she instructed. "He hates the smell of lavender. It was Martha's scent. He organizes his tools in the barn in a particular way. Don't ever move them. He doesn't talk about what's bothering him, but you can see it in his shoulders. If they're tight, the world is heavy. If they're loose, he's found a moment's peace." It was an education in the man she had married, delivered by the woman who knew him best. Emily listened, absorbed, and began to put the lessons into practice. She started to meet John's gaze instead of looking away. She learned to ask direct questions about the ranch that required more than a one-word answer. She began to move with purpose, her limp a temporary inconvenience, not a sign of fragility. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, John began to respond. He started to linger at the supper table for a few moments after he'd finished eating. He once commented that the stew was good. He even, on a day when she had successfully restacked a pile of firewood that had collapsed, gave her a curt, approving nod. Each small acknowledgement was a victory, a tiny seed of hope planted in the barren soil of their marriage. During this time, Emily's curiosity about the sleeping arrangements grew. Since her injury, she had occupied the master bed alone. John had not even pretended to share the room, taking his blanket to the barn every night without a word. Sarah's door remained firmly shut. One night, unable to sleep, Emily hobbled to the kitchen for a drink of water. The house was quiet. As she passed Sarah's room, she heard a sound, a soft, muffled sob. It was a sound of such profound loneliness that it stopped Emily in her tracks. The next day, as they sat shelling peas on the porch, Emily found the courage to ask, "Sarah, you and John," she began, her voice faltering, "since I've been here." Sarah didn't pretend to misunderstand. She kept her eyes on her work, her fingers splitting the pods with practiced efficiency. "Not just since you've been here," she said, her voice flat. "Not since the day we buried Martha. He hasn't shared a bed with a woman, not me, not anyone." The revelation stunned Emily. She had imagined them as a grieving couple, finding comfort in each other's arms in the dark of night. She had pictured Sarah as a rival who held a physical claim on John. The reality was so much starker, so much sadder. They were not lovers. They were two solitary figures bound by a shared past, living like shadows in a house that was no longer a home. Sarah was not her rival. She was a fellow prisoner of John's grief. The first snows of winter came early that year, dusting the mountaintops and bringing a sharp bite to the air. John began setting traps in the high country, seeking the thick winter pelts of beaver and fox that would fetch a high price. It was dangerous work, and every day he was gone. A quiet tension settled over the house. One evening, he didn't return. The sun set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood and rose, and still, there was no sign of him. Sarah paced the length of the cabin, her face a stoic mask that couldn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes. Emily, her ankle now mostly healed, watched the trail from the window, her heart a cold knot of dread. They waited through the night, keeping the fire roaring and a lamp burning in the window as a beacon. Just after dawn, they saw him. He was slumped over his horse, which was picking its way slowly and carefully down the trail. They rushed out to meet him. He was barely conscious, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His left leg was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. "A bear trap," he mumbled. "One of his own. A careless step while setting a new line." He had managed to free himself and crawl to his horse, but the journey back had taken all his strength. Between the two of them, they managed to get him inside and onto the bed. Sarah, with a surgeon's grim determination, cut away the trouser leg. The wound was deep, the steel jaws of the trap having torn through muscle and sinew. The leg was swollen and hot to the touch. For the next 3 days, they fought a battle for his life. The wound became infected, and a fever took hold of him. He thrashed in the bed, lost in a delirium that carried him back to other times, other sorrows. Emily and Sarah worked in tandem, a seamless, unspoken partnership. They boiled water, washed the wound, forced broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and took turns sitting by his side, placing cool, damp cloths on his burning forehead. The silences between them were no longer empty, but filled with a shared, desperate purpose. In his fever dreams, John talked. He spoke of his father, of a cattle drive, of the blizzard, and he spoke names. "Martha," he would moan, his hands reaching for someone who wasn't there. "Martha, I'm sorry. I was too late." Emily's heart would clench at the raw pain in his voice. She was a witness to a grief so profound it was etched into his very soul. But then, in the deepest hours of the third night, as Emily sat watch, he called out another name. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He turned his head on the pillow, his sightless eyes searching the room. "Don't leave me. Not you, too. Don't leave." Emily froze, the damp cloth in her hand. He had called for his wife, and he had called for Sarah. He was trapped in a nightmare with the two women who had defined his life, the two women he had loved and lost in different ways. And what of her, Emily, his wife, in his fevered mind? Did she even exist? The question took root in her heart and began to grow, a thorny, painful weed of doubt. Was she nothing more than a ghost in the waking world as well? A warm body to fill a cold bed? A pair of hands to do the work? He had not chosen her. He had ordered her, like a sack of flour or a new plow. He had married her not for who she was, but for what she represented. A chance to start over, a way to pretend the past could be buried. But the past was not buried. It was alive and breathing in this very room, in the names he called out in the dark. The fever broke on the fourth day. John woke, weak and lucid, to find Emily asleep in the chair beside his bed. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before his gaze drifted around the room, taking in the signs of their long vigil. His recovery was slow, but steady. He was confined to the house, and the forced inactivity made him restless and sullen. But the dynamic had changed again. He had been dependent on them, on both of them. He had seen their combined strength, their tireless care. He looked at Emily differently now, with a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps confusion, as if seeing her for the first time as a person, not a problem to be solved. A few weeks later, John was mobile again, walking with a heavy limp. The close confines of the winter cabin created a new kind of intimacy, one that was both comforting and fraught with tension. One night, after a simple supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread, Sarah, pleading exhaustion, retired early to her room. John brought a bottle of whiskey to the table. He poured a little into 2 tin cups, pushing one toward Emily. It was a peace offering, an invitation. She accepted it, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum. He drank, and, for the first time, he talked. He spoke of the land, of the way the seasons changed, of the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He did not speak of Martha, or the blizzard, or his grief. He spoke only of the present, of the tangible world around them. It was as if he were trying to anchor himself and her in the here and now. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the room. The whiskey was a fire in Emily's belly, loosening the knot of anxiety that was her constant companion. John's voice, low and rough, filled the silence that she had come to dread. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes, for the first time, seemed clear of the ghosts that usually haunted them. He reached across the table and took her hand. His was large and calloused, engulfing hers completely. The touch was electric, a shock of contact after months of distance. He stood, gently pulling her to her feet, and led her to the bedroom. This time, he did not stop at the window. He turned to her in the flickering candlelight, his gaze intense. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a rough, searching kiss, tasting of whiskey and a desperate, lonely hunger. Emily's heart soared. This was it. This was the beginning. All the waiting, all the loneliness, all the pain, it had all led to this. She gave herself over to the moment, to the solid feel of his arms around her, to the hope that was finally, gloriously, blooming in her chest. He led her to the bed and laid her down. He was not a gentle lover, but she hadn't expected him to be. He was a man of the earth, strong and direct, and his touch was the same. His body was heavy and warm upon hers, a welcome anchor in the cold, lonely night. But as the moments passed, a chilling realization began to creep into the edges of her joy. While his body was with her, his mind, his soul, was somewhere else. His eyes, when they met hers in the dim light, were unfocused, looking through her, not at her. His touch was mechanical, the fulfillment of a need, not the expression of a shared passion. He was seeking release, an escape from his own mind, and she was merely the vessel for it. He was a man drowning, and he had pulled her under with him, not to save her, but to use her as a raft. When it was over, he rolled away from her without a word and fell into a heavy, drunken sleep. Emily lay beside him, the silence roaring in her ears. The warmth of a moment before had vanished, leaving a cold more profound than any she had ever known. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in her chest had been brutally extinguished, leaving behind only the bitter smoke of disillusionment. Tears welled in her eyes and traced hot paths down her temples into her hair. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she slipped out of the bed. She pulled a quilt around her trembling shoulders and walked out of the room, out of the house, and onto the front porch. The night was clear and bitterly cold. A million stars were scattered across the black velvet of the sky, distant and indifferent. She sat on the top step, pulling the quilt tighter around her, and let the tears fall freely. A few moments later, the door creaked open behind her. It was Sarah. She held a shawl around her shoulders and came to sit beside Emily on the step. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not offer platitudes or useless words of comfort. She simply sat with her, a solid, silent presence in the vast, empty night. She put an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. Emily leaned into the warmth, her sobs quieting into ragged, hiccuping breaths. They sat like that for a long time, two women huddled together against the cold, looking up at the indifferent stars. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice a low, steady murmur in the darkness. "If we don't hold on to each other," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant constellations, "no one else will." The morning that followed was a landscape of ash. The brief, fiery hope Emily had felt had been consumed, leaving a cold and brittle emptiness in its wake. John rose before dawn, as he always did, but he did not look at her. He dressed in silence, the familiar ritual now feeling like a deliberate act of erasure, and left for the barn. When Emily finally emerged from the bedroom, a hollowed-out ghost in her own skin, Sarah was already in the kitchen, stoking the fire. She glanced at Emily, her dark eyes taking in the younger woman's pale face and shadowed eyes. But she said nothing. There was no need. The failure of the night before hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating as smoke. For 2 days, they moved through this new, fragile silence. It was different from the silences that had come before. It was not a silence of grief or of hostility, but of resignation, a final, unspoken admission that their arrangement, this desperate attempt to build a new life on the foundations of an old one, was unsustainable. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. On the third morning, Emily came into the kitchen to find a large, worn carpet bag on the floor by the door. Sarah was at the pantry, methodically taking down tins of coffee, a slab of bacon, and a sack of flour, and placing them into a crate. "What are you doing?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm leaving," Sarah said. Without turning around, her tone was flat, a simple statement of fact. "There's a man I know in Cheyenne, runs a boarding house. He wrote a while back, said he could use a manager, a new start. Cheyenne, Wyoming." The words sounded like a foreign country, a place on the other side of the world. The carpet bag on the floor seemed to suck all the air from the room. A wave of dizziness washed over Emily. "Leaving?" she repeated, the word feeling clumsy and stupid in her mouth. "But this is your home." Sarah finally turned, wiping her dusty hands on her apron. Her face was set, her expression unyielding, but for a flicker of something in her eyes. Weariness, perhaps, or a deep, abiding sadness. No, Emily. This was Martha's home, and it is John's home. For a time, I was its keeper. Now, it is your home. You are his wife. The words, which should have been a confirmation of her place, felt like a judgment, a final severing. Emily looked around the kitchen, the stove she had finally mastered, the herb rack she had organized, the curtains she had mended. She had fought for every small piece of this life, and her greatest ally, her most fearsome teacher, was now abandoning the field. "But I can't," Emily stammered, the truth of it a cold panic in her chest. She couldn't run this place alone. She couldn't manage the ledgers, or bargain with the traders, or set a broken bone. More than that, she couldn't face the crushing weight of John's silence by herself. She had survived because Sarah had been there, a second, stronger wall against the loneliness. "You will," Sarah said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You are stronger than you were when you arrived. This land has put some iron in your spine." She turned back to her packing, the gesture a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. For the rest of the day, Emily watched Sarah move through the house, gathering her few possessions with a quiet, resolute efficiency. A small box of letters, a worn copy of the Bible, the daguerreotype of herself and a young John. Each item she placed in her bag was another nail in the coffin of the life they had built. A profound sense of emptiness began to hollow Emily out. This feeling was more complex than mere panic. It was a genuine sense of loss, a grief that was sharp and bewildering. She had come to depend on Sarah's strength, to admire her resilience, to find comfort in her abrasive honesty. In the desolate landscape of her new life, Sarah had become her only landmark. The thought of the house without her steady, formidable presence was unimaginable. It wasn't just that she was losing an ally. She was losing the only person who had ever looked at her and seen not a replacement or a burden, but a reflection of herself. John came in from the fields at dusk, his shoulders tight, his face grim. The air was heavy and smelled of rain. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the packed crate and the carpet bag. He looked from the bags to Sarah, who was wiping down the kitchen table for the last time. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I'm leaving, John," Sarah said calmly. "I'm taking the morning stage to Cheyenne." John closed the door behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. "You're what?" "You heard me." He walked towards her, his limp more pronounced than usual. He looked not just tired, but suddenly older, stripped of the stoic composure he wore like armor. "You can't leave." It wasn't a request. It was an order, born of a sudden, raw panic. "I can," Sarah said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "There's nothing for me here anymore. The house has a mistress. You have a wife. My work is done." "Your work?" he scoffed, a dark, bitter anger rising in his voice. This was more emotion than Emily had seen from him in all her months at the ranch. "You think this was just a job, keeping house for me?" "What else would you call it?" she shot back, her own voice rising to meet his. "I have been the ghost at your table for a year. John, I have tended your wounds and your books and your broken heart. I have watched you fade away. And I have stayed. But I will not stay to watch this." She gestured vaguely towards the bedroom, a clear reference to the night he had spent with Emily. "That has nothing to do with you," he said, his jaw tight. "It has everything to do with me," Sarah's voice cracked. "Because it's not fair. Not to her, and not to me. You are using her to try and forget Martha. And you are using me to keep Martha's memory alive. We are two halves of the woman you lost, and neither of us can ever be whole for you." "That's not true," he bit out, but his eyes darted away, unable to meet the force of her accusation. "It is the truest thing anyone has ever said in this house," she cried, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I can't do it anymore. I can't live in her shadow, and I won't watch you force this girl to do the same. It's time for you to stand on your own. Or fall. The first roll of thunder sounded in the distance, a low, ominous rumble. Rain began to patter against the roof. The storm was coming. John's face was a mask of fury and desperation. For the first time since Martha's death, the carefully constructed walls around his heart were crumbling, and the man beneath was raw, exposed, and terrified. "You can't leave me," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "You promised, after the blizzard, you promised you wouldn't leave me alone here." The confession, the admission of his dependence on her, hung between them, a testament to the deep, tangled roots of their shared history. Emily had been watching from the corner, a silent observer to the drama that had defined her life in this place. She had been a ghost, a spare part, a third person in a story that was not her own. But hearing them, seeing their raw, undisguised pain, something inside her snapped. The fear, the loneliness, the feeling of utter worthlessness. All of it coalesced into a single, burning point of rage. She stepped forward, into the space between them, her hands trembling but her voice clear and strong, cutting through their argument like a blade. "Stop it!" she cried, and they both turned to stare at her, shocked into silence by her outburst. "Just stop it. This whole house. It's a tomb. It's a shrine to a woman I never knew. And you two are its keepers." She looked at John, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "You married me. You brought me 1,000 miles from everything I knew, and you have not touched me, not spoken to me, not even truly looked at me. You treat me like a piece of furniture you accidentally ordered." Then she turned to Sarah. "And you have been my teacher and my tormentor. You taught me how to be strong, but you resent me for being here. You saved my life, and now you are abandoning me. You talk about fairness? What about me? What about the life I was promised?" The wind howled outside, and the rain began to lash against the windows. Emily's voice rose to be heard above the growing storm. "I did not come here to be the third person between the two of you, but I will not accept being a spare part either," she screamed, the words torn from the very depths of her soul. "I am not a ghost. I am not a replacement. I am a woman, and I will not be invisible anymore." As if her words had summoned it, a blinding flash of lightning lit up the room, followed instantaneously by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations. It was not a distant rumble. It was immediate, violent, and terrifyingly close. Through the window, they saw the cause. The lightning had struck the massive old cottonwood tree that stood near the corner of the cattle pen. The tree exploded in a shower of splintered wood and fire, and a huge, flaming limb crashed down onto the fence, shattering it. The cattle, who had been huddled together against the rain, went mad with terror. They bellowed and surged against the broken fence, their eyes white with panic, threatening a full-scale stampede that would scatter them across the plains or drive them into the very ravine where Emily had fallen. For a split second, the three of them stood frozen. The personal storm inside the cabin was eclipsed by the literal one raging outside. Then, instinct took over. The habits of survival, ingrained by years on the unforgiving land, superseded all else. "The herd!" John yelled, his face grim. He grabbed a heavy rain slicker from a hook and was out the door in a flash. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed another slicker, shoved it at Emily, and pulled on her own. "Stay behind the horse," she commanded, her voice sharp and clear. All personal turmoil forgotten in the face of the immediate crisis. "Don't let them see you panic." They ran out into the maelstrom. The rain was a solid wall of water, and the wind threatened to tear them from their feet. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, rain, and the acrid smoke from the burning tree. The cattle were a chaotic, surging mass of horns and hides, their panicked bellows a terrifying chorus. John was already there, his horse between the herd and the broken fence, trying to turn them, to force them back into the relative safety of the pen. It was a hopeless task for one man. Sarah vaulted onto the top rail of the intact part of the fence, shouting, waving her arms, making herself a large, intimidating presence to help turn the lead steer. Emily, her heart hammering against her ribs, did as she was told. She found John's horse tethered near the barn and untied it, leading it into the fray. The ground was a treacherous sea of mud. She was terrified, but the adrenaline, the sheer, primal need to act, was stronger than her fear. She saw a gap in the line John was trying to hold and, without thinking, ran towards it, flapping her slicker, shouting until her throat was raw. For what felt like an eternity, they fought. They were no longer John, Emily, and Sarah. They were a single unit, a three-headed creature battling chaos. They moved in a strange, unspoken rhythm, anticipating each other's movements, plugging gaps, turning the tide of panic one terrified animal at a time. John, on his horse, was the anchor. Sarah, agile and fearless on the fence, was the flank. And Emily, on the ground, was the unpredictable force, darting where she was needed, her earlier outburst having burned away her last vestiges of timidity. Slowly, painstakingly, they regained control. They forced the herd away from the ravine, away from the broken fence, and back into the far corner of the pen. The immediate danger passed. The stampede had been averted, soaked to the skin, covered in mud, and utterly exhausted. They stood together in the driving rain as the last of the panicked cattle settled. The fire in the cottonwood tree hissed and sputtered, slowly being extinguished by the downpour. They didn't speak. They simply looked at each other, their faces streaked with rain and grime, their chests heaving. In the chaotic violence of the storm, all the masks had been stripped away. There were no ghosts, no replacements, no spare parts. There were only three people who had faced down a crisis together and won. There was trust. There was survival. They trooped back into the cabin, dripping water onto the floorboards. Sarah immediately set about rebuilding the fire, her movements sure and steady. Emily put a kettle on for coffee. John brought the whiskey bottle back to the table. They sat around the hearth, wrapped in dry blankets, the fire slowly chasing the chill from their bones. The silence that fell was not empty or tense. It was a silence of profound, shared exhaustion, the kind that comes after a battle. There were no more walls between them. No one was an outsider. They had been forged into something new in the heart of the storm. John looked at Sarah, at the strength and history in her face. Then he looked at Emily, at the fierce, unexpected fire he had seen in her tonight. He took a long, slow breath, the air shuddering in his chest. "If you two aren't leaving," he said, his voice low and rough, his gaze moving between them, "then stay, with me." John's invitation hung in the air, as quiet and momentous as the calm after a storm. It was not a question, not a command, but a simple statement of a new reality. Stay, with me. It was a proposition so far beyond the bounds of their world that it had no name. Sarah's bags remained by the door, unpacked. The morning stage to Cheyenne came and went without her. A new unspoken treaty had been signed in the heart of the storm, and they now faced the daunting task of learning to live by its terms. The first days were a delicate, intricate dance. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a hypersensitivity to the space between them. The rigid roles they had once occupied, husband, wife, cousin-in-law, had been shattered, and they were left with the raw, uncertain truth of who they were to one another. Emily found herself watching John and Sarah, not with suspicion, but with a kind of anthropological curiosity. She saw the shorthand of their shared history, the way a raised eyebrow from Sarah could convey a whole paragraph of meaning to John, the way he knew instinctively to move the heavy flour sack before she had to ask. But she also saw the new deference he showed her. Emily. He would wait for her to sit before he began to eat. He would ask her opinion on mending a fence or rotating the cattle to a new pasture. He was trying. in his own clumsy, silent way, to honor the woman who had screamed her existence into the heart of their shared grief. Sarah, for her part, ceded territory. She stopped acting as the sole mistress of the house and began to act as a partner. It was she who suggested Emily take over the household ledgers, patiently guiding her through the columns of figures. "You have a finer hand for it than I do," she said. A simple statement that was, from Sarah, the highest form of praise. They worked together, a formidable team. Emily's quiet diligence complemented Sarah's fierce practicality. They fell into a rhythm, running the domestic side of the ranch with an efficiency that left John free to focus on the fields and the herd. The house, once a tomb of silence and sorrow, began to fill with the quiet hum of purposeful work. There was even, on rare occasions, a shared, fleeting smile over a small success, a perfectly baked loaf of bread, a calf successfully weaned. John changed the most. The crushing weight on his shoulders seemed to have lessened. The haunted look in his eyes was still there, a permanent shadow of the man he had been. But it was no longer all-consuming. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in observations about the world around them. The hawk circling overhead, the way the creek was running high, the color of the sunset. He was re-engaging with life, one small, tentative step at a time. He still slept in the barn, a final barrier he was not yet ready to cross. But the gesture no longer felt like a rejection of Emily. It felt, instead, like a respectful acknowledgement that the rules of their world no longer applied, and he did not yet know what the new ones were. But their fragile new world existed in a bubble, a 10-mile radius of self-contained understanding. Beyond the borders of the ranch lay Redemption Gulch, a town built on judgment and fueled by gossip. And it was not long before the outside world came to tear at the seams of their unconventional peace. The first trip into town together was a necessity. Winter was closing in, and they needed supplies: salt, sugar, ammunition, and heavy wool for new blankets. They rode in the wagon, John at the reins, Sarah and Emily sitting side by side on the bench. The truce they had forged in the cabin felt strong and real. But as they drew closer to the dusty main street, a palpable tension settled over them. The whispers started at the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife and the town's chief arbiter of morality, gave them a look that was colder than a January wind. As Emily counted out the coins for their purchases, she could hear the women huddled by the fabric bolts, their voices a low, venomous buzz. The words were indistinct, but the meaning was clear in their sidelong glances and tight, disapproving mouths. When Emily turned, they fell silent, their faces masks of pious condemnation. Outside, the feeling of being watched, of being judged, was even stronger. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare as they loaded their supplies. No one tipped their hat. No one offered a friendly greeting. They were a spectacle, a puzzle that the town's simple, rigid morality could not solve. A man with his wife and his late wife's cousin. It was odd, but not yet a scandal. The scandal was born a week later, when Emily went into town alone to retrieve a special order of garden seeds. She had hoped that by herself, she might be invisible. She was wrong. As she stepped out of the general store, a group of women, led by Mrs. Gable, blocked her path. They were a formidable wall of calico and self-righteousness. "Well, well," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "If it isn't the little mail-order bride." Emily's heart began to hammer. She tried to step around them, but they shifted, closing ranks. "Tell me, dear," another woman, Mrs. Prentice, chimed in. "It must be so crowded in that little house. I hear she even has the key to the master's bedroom," a third whispered, loud enough for everyone on the boardwalk to hear. Emily's face burned with shame. She clutched her small package of seeds to her chest like a shield. "Please, let me pass." "What's the matter?" Mrs. Gable's smile was a cruel slash. "Don't you like to talk about your happy home? It's all the town can talk about. A man with 2 women to warm his bed, though I suppose one is more of a mother-in-law. Isn't she? Tell me, which is it? It's all so confusing." The women tittered. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave. And then came the final, brutal blow, delivered by Mrs. Gable with the precision of a butcher's knife. "A harlot with 2 mothers-in-law," she said, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "One dead, one living, the things a body sees in these godless territories." The word struck Emily with the force of a slap. She flinched, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The laughter of the women, the curious stares of the men who had stopped to watch the show. It was a nightmare. She stood there, stripped bare, her name and her honor shredded in the dusty street for all to see. News of the incident traveled the 10 miles back to the ranch before Emily did. A neighboring ranch hand had witnessed the scene and reported it to John with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. When Emily finally rode in, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed, she found John and Sarah waiting for her on the porch. Sarah's face was a thundercloud. 2 days later, they all rode into town. John had insisted. "We will not hide," he had said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We will not give them the satisfaction." They walked down the main street, a united, defiant front. The stares were more brazen this time, the whispers louder. In front of the saloon, a burly, drunk trapper named Silas Croft, egged on by his friends, stepped into their path. He leered at Emily. "Well now, John, heard you got yourself a full house. Must be a lucky man." He then turned his attention to Sarah. "Or maybe just a busy one. Don't wear yourself out." Old man. John's hand went to the pistol on his hip, but Sarah was faster. She didn't reach for a weapon. She moved with the speed of a striking snake. She took 2 steps forward and drove the heel of her hand up under Silas Croft's chin. His head snapped back with a sickening crack, and his eyes rolled up. He staggered backward, stunned. Before he could recover, she followed it with a hard, sharp fist to his gut. The air whooshed out of him in a great gasp, and he folded, collapsing into the dusty street, wheezing for breath. Silence fell over the boardwalk. No one had ever seen a woman, a respectable woman, strike a man with such brutal efficiency. Sarah stood over the gasping trapper, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a protective fury that was terrifying to behold. "The next man," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the onlookers. "Who speaks a word against this family will answer to me, and I assure you I am in a far fouler temper than John is." The incident cemented their status as outcasts. The whispers turned into open condemnation. They were no longer just an oddity. They were a scandal, a blight on the moral fabric of Redemption Gulch. The final blow came on a Sunday. The Reverend Michael Miller, a man whose piety was matched only by his self-importance, rode out to the ranch himself. He sat stiffly in their main room, refusing a cup of coffee. He came, he said, as a shepherd tending to a lost and diseased flock. He spoke of sin and abomination, of the sanctity of marriage as an institution between one man and one woman. He quoted scripture, his voice rising in righteous fervor. "This arrangement is an offense against God and man," he declared, his gaze moving between the 3 of them. "The town will not stand for it. As your spiritual guide, I am here to demand that you rectify this situation. Mrs. Croft," he said, his eyes landing on Sarah, "you must leave this place. Go to Cheyenne, as you had planned. Remove yourself from this house of impropriety." John, who had been listening in a stony silence, finally stood up. He was taller than the preacher, his presence filling the room with a quiet, physical power. "Reverend," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "you are a guest in my house, but you are a guest who has overstayed his welcome." He walked to the door and opened it. "My Bible tells me to judge not, lest I be judged. It seems you favor other passages." The preacher sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red.
"This is defiance! This is a rejection of the laws of God!"
"This," John said, his voice as hard as iron, "is my family, and this is my land." He looked the preacher squarely in the eye, his next words a declaration of war. "Anyone who sets foot in my house lives by my ways, or they can stay out." The preacher, defeated, left in a huff, promising fire and brimstone. After he was gone, a heavy silence settled in the room. John had drawn a line in the sand. He had defended them. He had called them a family. But the victory felt hollow. They were now truly alone, an island of defiance in a sea of condemnation. The constant pressure, the glares, the whispers, the open hostility, it all began to take its toll. Emily, who had fought so hard to find her strength, began to wilt under the relentless barrage of judgment. She grew quiet, withdrawn. The shadows returned to her eyes. One morning, she couldn't get out of bed. A fever had taken hold of her, a deep, consuming fire that left her weak and delirious. The town doctor, when summoned, made a cursory visit, diagnosed a lung fever, left some quinine powders, and couldn't get away fast enough. It was clear he considered the sickness a form of divine retribution. It was Sarah who became her nurse, her guardian, her anchor, for a week, as Emily tossed and turned in the throes of the fever. Sarah did not leave her side. She sat in the chair by the bed, the same chair where Emily had watched John during his own delirium. She bathed Emily's forehead, forced water and broth past her lips, and listened to her fevered ramblings. In the deepest hours of the night, when the fever was at its worst and Emily's breathing was shallow and ragged, John would come and stand in the doorway, his face a mask of helpless anguish. He would watch Sarah tend to his wife, her movements gentle and sure, her face etched with a fierce, desperate concern. One night, he found Sarah on her knees by the bedside, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had never seen Sarah cry, not even after Martha's death. He realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, the depth of the bond that had formed between these two women. This was not duty. This was not pity. This was love, in a form he did not have a name for. He came into the room and put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "She is burning up," she whispered, her voice raw with fear. "I don't know what else to do." He knelt beside her, and together they prayed, not to the preacher's vengeful God, but to whatever force in the universe might listen to the desperate pleas of a broken family. The fever broke 2 days later. Emily woke, weak but clear-headed, to find Sarah asleep in the chair, her hand resting protectively on the edge of the mattress. The first thing Emily saw was the profound exhaustion and love etched on the older woman's face. That night, a slow, steady rain began to fall, drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the wooden roof. John had moved a cot into the main room to be closer, and the three of them were together in the quiet heart of the house. The storm of the fever had passed, just as the thunderstorm had before it, leaving a deep and settled calm in its wake. Emily was propped up on pillows, sipping a cup of tea. Sarah sat in the chair beside her, her sewing lying forgotten in her lap. John stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the raw intimacy of a shared crisis. John turned from the fire. He looked at Sarah, at the woman who had been his first love, his anchor, his conscience. He saw the years of sacrifice, the unwavering loyalty, the fierce love that had refused to let him go. He walked to her, and for the first time since before he had married Martha, he reached out and took her hand. He knelt before her chair and simply held her hand, his head bowed, a silent acknowledgement of a debt he could never repay. Sarah looked down at his bowed head, at his large, strong hand holding hers, and her own carefully constructed walls finally, completely, crumbled. She brought her other hand up to cup his cheek, her touch infinitely tender. Emily watched them from the bed. She saw the lifetime of unspoken love, of shared history, of grief and regret and fierce devotion that passed between them in that single, silent moment. A year ago, the sight would have shattered her. She would have seen it as the ultimate confirmation of her status as an outsider. But now, she felt no jealousy. There was no sting of betrayal. She felt only a deep, aching wave of love for them both. She had seen Sarah's terror as she fought for Emily's life. She had seen John's helpless grief. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that her place was not between them, but with them. The greatest pain, she now realized, was not in sharing love, but in being excluded from it. And she would not be excluded, not anymore. Slowly, she pushed back the covers. Her legs were weak, but she found her feet. She stood, a thin, frail figure in her white nightgown, and walked the few steps to where they knelt. They both looked up as she approached, their eyes wide. She did not speak. She simply knelt down with them, in the warm glow of the firelight. She reached out, placing her hand over their joined hands. John looked from Sarah's tear-streaked face to Emily's pale, determined one. He slowly, hesitantly, brought his other arm around Emily's waist, pulling her into their small circle. Sarah, in turn, wrapped her arm around Emily's shoulders. There, on the floor of the cabin, with the rain drumming a gentle rhythm on the roof, the last barriers fell. There were no more roles, no more names, no more ghosts. There were no longer three separate, lonely souls fighting for a place. They were a single, breathing entity, bound by survival, by loyalty, and by a love that their world had no words for. It was a union forged not in passion, but in the profound, desperate need to simply hold on to one another. It was a silent vow, made in the heart of the storm, to never let go. And in that moment, in that quiet, revolutionary embrace, they were, finally and completely, home. A year passed. The land, which had once seemed so determined to break them, now yielded to their combined will. The seasons turned, and with them, the ranch was reborn. The scar on the old cottonwood tree where the lightning had struck was a stark, silver reminder of the night their world had fractured and reformed. A new barn stood beside the old one. Its fresh pines sent a testament to a year of hard, shared labor. The herd was larger, the cattle fat and healthy under Sarah's watchful, expert eye. Emily's garden had expanded, a riot of color and life that spilled from its fenced enclosure, providing them with more than enough to eat and a surplus to trade in town. The house itself felt different. It breathed. The oppressive silence of grief had been replaced by the steady, comforting rhythm of a life being fully lived. They had become a unit, a three-stranded braid, each strand distinct but woven together to create a strength that none possessed alone. Their roles had settled not by decree, but by a natural, unspoken understanding of their individual talents. Sarah was the mistress of the outdoors. She rose with the sun, her element the wide-open spaces, the smell of livestock and hay. She had a sixth sense for the animals, knowing which cow was about to calve, which horse had a stone in its hoof, which section of the pasture needed rest. She was tireless, her formidable energy now channeled into growth and prosperity rather than the maintenance of sorrow. She was the iron spine of the ranch. Emily, in turn, became the heart of the home and its sharp, calculating mind. The ledgers, once a source of intimidation, were now her domain. She tracked every penny, every trade, her elegant script filling the pages with a story of their growing success. Her garden was her sanctuary and her laboratory, and the root cellar was a treasure trove of preserved vegetables, fruits, and medicinal herbs. She managed their supplies with a careful, forward-thinking precision that Sarah, for all her practicality, had never possessed. She was the quiet, steady hand that ensured their hard work was never wasted. And John was a man transformed. The ghosts had not vanished entirely, a deep loss like his leaves permanent scars, but they no longer had dominion over him. He was present. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by the clear, steady gaze of a man with a purpose. He worked with a renewed vigor, his powerful frame a familiar sight mending fences, clearing new pasture, and working alongside Sarah with the herd. But the most profound change was in the quiet moments. He would sit at the supper table and listen, truly listen, to the women discuss their day. A slow, genuine smile would sometimes touch his lips, and on a warm summer evening, as he watched Emily patiently weed her rows of beans, the sound of his laughter, a deep, rusty, and utterly beautiful sound, was heard in the yard for the first time in years. He was the foundation upon which their strange, wonderful house was built. They lived as a family, bound by a love that defied definition. There was no name for what they were to each other, so they did not try to name it. They simply lived it. Each of them had a place, a value, a purpose. Each of them was loved, not for who they were supposed to be, but for who they were. John's affection for Sarah was a quiet, deep reverence for their shared history and her unwavering strength. His love for Emily was a tender, protective awe at the gentle woman who had revealed a core of unbreakable steel. Sarah and Emily's bond was perhaps the most complex, a fierce, sisterly devotion forged in the fires of conflict and shared survival. They were a closed circle, complete. The world outside, the world of Redemption Gulch, had not forgotten them. But its power to wound had diminished. The open hostility had faded, worn down by their sheer, stubborn refusal to be broken. They were still a source of gossip, a cautionary tale whispered over sewing circles. But the venom had lost its sting. Their success was a powerful argument against their sinfulness. A ranch that thrived as theirs did could not be entirely cursed by God. Other homesteaders, pragmatic people who understood the brutal calculus of survival, began to view them with a grudging respect. When Ben Carter's prize bull was gored by a wild boar, it was John he came to for help, knowing John had the steadiest hand with a needle and thread. Sarah sent Ben's wife a pot of her powerful fever-reducing tea, and Emily included a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of pickles with the delivery. They asked for nothing in return. They did not preach or condemn. They simply helped a neighbor in need. The Carters never became friends, but they stopped talking behind their hands when John's wagon passed. One, by quiet acts of competence and decency, they were carving out a space for themselves, proving that a family was defined not by its shape, but by its strength. One morning in the early autumn, as the aspens in the high country were turning a brilliant, quaking gold, their world changed again. John was walking to the barn in the pre-dawn light when he saw something by the front gate, a place where nothing should be. It was a large wicker basket. He approached it cautiously, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. As he drew closer, he heard a sound, a small, plaintive whimper. He looked inside. There, nestled in a pile of clean but worn blankets, was a baby. It couldn't have been more than a few days old, its face red and wrinkled, its tiny fists clenched. Pinned to the blanket was a crudely written note. His name is Samuel. His mother is gone. Please. John stood there for a long moment, the cold morning air on his face, the vast, silent prairie stretching out around him. He looked at the tiny, helpless creature, and a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. He gently lifted the basket and carried it into the house. Emily and Sarah were in the kitchen, starting the coffee. They looked up, their eyes widening at the sight of the basket. He placed it on the table without a word. Emily was the first to look inside. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Oh my. Sarah came to stand beside her. She looked at the baby, then at the note, then at John's face. She saw no hesitation there, no question. She saw only a fierce, protective tenderness. The baby, disturbed by the movement, began to cry, a thin, reedy wail that cut through the morning stillness. And in that moment, there was no debate, no discussion of the consequences or the added burden. There was only an immediate, unanimous, and overwhelming sense of recognition. This was not an intrusion. This was not a problem. This was a miracle. Emily, her hands trembling slightly, reached into the basket and lifted the baby into her arms. He was so small, so warm. He quieted almost instantly, his tiny head nuzzling into the crook of her neck. Sarah moved to the stove, her movements brisk and purposeful, already preparing warm, sweetened milk. John stood watch over them all, a silent, solid guardian. The empty spaces in the house, the corners that had once held the ghosts of a child that never was, were suddenly, irrevocably filled. Samuel was theirs. He was the final, perfect piece of their unconventional family, a new life to anchor them firmly in the future. That evening, as the baby slept soundly in a cradle John had hastily fashioned from an old crate, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. For a long time, she had considered writing a letter to her aunt in Boston, a triumphant, angry letter to prove how wrong she had been. But the anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The letter she wrote now was for herself, a way to measure the distance she had traveled, not in miles, but in the growth of her own heart. "Dearest Mother and Father," she wrote, her pen scratching softly in the lamplight. It was to them she had always written in her heart. "It has been more than a year since I left Boston. I imagine if you could see me now, you would not recognize the pale, frightened girl who stepped onto that train. The West has changed me. My hands are calloused, and my face is browned by the sun. I know the names of the wildflowers, and I can tell when a storm is coming by the color of the sky. I have known hardship, and I have known a loneliness so profound I thought it would consume me. But I have also known a strength I never knew I possessed. I came here seeking a home, a place to belong. I thought a home was a simple thing, a house, a husband, a life that followed the rules. I have learned that it is so much more than that. It is a place where you are seen, where you are valued, where you can be your truest self without fear or shame. It is a place built not of wood and stone, but of trust and forgiveness and a love that is strong enough to stand against the judgment of the world. I have found my home. It is not a place that all would accept, but it is where my heart belongs. It is a place of peace." She set down her pen, her eyes glistening with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a deep and abiding gratitude. The sun was setting, bleeding across the vast western sky in brilliant streaks of orange, purple, and crimson. John came and sat on the top step of the porch, his customary place. A moment later, Sarah came out, carrying the sleeping baby, and sat in the rocking chair that had once belonged to Martha. It was no longer a shrine to the past, but a seat for the future. Emily followed, taking her place on the step beside John, leaning her head against his shoulder. The three of them sat in a comfortable, perfect silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The wind, which had once seemed so malicious, now whispered through the tall grass like a lullaby. No one spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. They were simply there, together. A man and two women and a child. A strange and beautiful constellation against the darkening prairie. They had each other, and it was enough. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories. And share your thoughts on the journey of John, Sarah, and Emily.